I'm so excited to have you here, Matthew. I tune into your podcast every now and then, and I'm either loving it or kind of triggered by it. But I've come back to it time and again because it's so easy to fall into these sort of harmful dynamics. And why do you think that most people committed to their spiritual growth are at risk to end up in some sort of harmful cult dynamics?
Well, I think there are a lot of factors at play. I mean, most of the cult literature that I'm aware of usually starts from the principle of situational vulnerability. That if you are, socially detached, if you've recently been divorced, if you've lost a job, if you are living in rising global fascism, maybe, if you're watching, chaos in your neighborhood, if you have lost contact with a more sort of institutional religion, there's a lot to be said for the kind of welcome and kind of utopian promises that are offered by a high demand group.
You're listening to Mind Love with me, Melissa Monti.
I don't think we should underestimate the power of a relatively small social organization immediately offering kindness and welcome to you, or so it seems. It might be deceptive in some way or another, but in the two high demand groups that I was in, for instance, people really did welcome me. I really was given a sense of, you can actually relax here, and we're going to listen to your story, and we're going to, include it in with the kind of discourse of the entire group, and we're going to help you make meaning of it. And there's a lot of attention that is given. And then there's also, I think this is crucial, there's a sense of a kind of communism that is immediately offered in many high demand situations, which is just to say, at least from the outset, you are taken into a community that seems to want to share everything with you, right? And that can be that can come down to the material level. It's not necessarily just about, ideas and wisdom and practices and whatever, but it can come down to, if you can't afford to come to this retreat, it's free. If you are willing to do some work in the kitchen, which is going to be very fun, then you can attend. We're going to provide for you some very, very cheap room and board for a certain amount of time. And moreover, we're going to communicate that if you're with us, then everything is shared. Now, that's rarely actually true. It's very easy for the sort of the deception of that to start to show through. But I think we're talking about the vibrancy of a number of social promises that high demand groups offer. And it's really easy for them to offer what they offer in the context of kind of spiritual awakening or, personal development.
I joke quite a bit on this show that I would be the first to join a cult and the first to leave. I've found myself in quite a few situations, not official cult status, but just groups where I yearn for that type of belonging, especially as an only child with divorced parents. I can trace back, everything makes sense. And I've just always been looking for that sisterhood, even sororities in college. But when something goes wrong, when I notice something, I always feel like I'm the first to be sounding the alarm. And so I'm the first to be outcast from it. So I am proud of my ability to not be afraid to burn it all down to get to the truth. But I'm curious, in your story, you spent a lot of your 20s in cults. What made you vulnerable then that you thought would protect you?
Well, I think there's two broad sort of parts to me that, contributed to this vulnerability. And one was that I did not really have a strong social network when I was in my mid-20s and I was first recruited into this kind of like neo-Buddhist high demand group. And I had moved from home. I had dropped out of college. I was probably clinically depressed, but undiagnosed. And I was undiagnosed because it just wasn't in my family culture to sort of seek out that kind of help. And I also could not really find political and economic meaning in life. And one of the reasons that I dropped out of college, even though like I think I have all of the sort of talent that it would take to have been made that into a career in literary theory or religious studies or any of the things that I loved to study. Um, you know, the time at which it really sort of was the decision moment for, are you going to go farther with this? I was looking at the academic job market and realizing that, oh, none of my friends who do all of the cool things that I love are getting jobs, and that stayed true. This is the 90s. That has stayed true for a very long time, more or less. I mean, and I'm comparing this, of course, to stories of my boomer parents, right? I'm Gen X. So it's just gotten harder and harder and harder for people who are, creative. Maybe they're not, neurotypical. Maybe they are, what they really love to do is to think in the humanities stream of life. And it's very difficult to find sort of intellectual labor employment that's going to be steady. And as soon as I turned away from, finishing higher education, I was kind of wandering. I could publish novels and books of poetry and stuff like that, but I basically moved from one service job to another, and I couldn't see where the end point of that was. And for a lot of people who wind up choosing a kind of counterculture bohemian life in their 20s, it usually works if they have strong social connections, if they live in a vibrant neighborhood, if they live collectively, if they have good friendship bonds. And I just didn't. So that was one factor. And then the other thing that I think was crucial was that the world itself, and these are tied together, actually, the sort of material economic stuff and then the psychological stuff. The world as I was experiencing it just did not make any sense. I could not understand why there was such deep, inequality, wealth inequality in the world. I couldn't understand why, as we were starting to learn about climate change, nothing was being done about it. I couldn't understand why there seemed to be, perpetual imperialistic wars around the world. None of that made sense, and I didn't have any sort of like, I didn't have any resources to sort of address that fundamental confusion. And that is something that very charismatic spiritual teachers kind of specialize in, is taking the person who is really baffled by life and looking them straight in the eye, and saying, "Oh, I can lead you somewhere." And of course, it's mysterious and it's projective and it's intrusive, and of course the person doesn't know you at all when they're doing that, but it's very, very effective. It can be very profound.
So, what would you say the difference is between a spiritual teacher who is genuinely challenging someone versus one who's manipulating them?
I think you have to sort of take your time and see what the product of the interchange is, right? So I think that the charismatic, first of all, I mean, there are some warning signs from the outside that the person is probably in it for themselves rather than for, any kind of altruistic purpose. And to be honest, when we're talking about like spiritual groups, most of the time, especially in the neoliberal period, in this sort of 70s, 80s, 90s period that we're still in the hangover from, most of the time leaders are in it for themselves. It's very hard to actually think of an organization in which there wasn't some kind of cult of personality around the person who is very gratified at being able to, dispense their wisdom. So warning signs would be self-referentiality. Like, does everything in the group always come back to the sort of inscrutable wisdom of the leader? Is the leader being praised a lot? Is the focus of the organization about hanging on what the leader is saying from day to day? Are people tracking what the leader is saying from day to day in the same way that they're tracking the news about the White House or whatever, to see what the subtle changes are, to see how they can organize themselves in relationship to the leader? Or is it a much simpler environment in which there's some kind of institutional guardrails for, attending a class or a lecture or a meeting or something like that, and being able to openly discuss ideas, be challenged by them, and then, go on your way. And if the sort of exchange or the transaction of that is also very clear, like, I came to your class and I paid the pay what you can, or I did the chores, or I coordinated with some sort of community service, then if the arrangement, the financial arrangement, is clear, or the exchange relationship is clear and transparent, then I think that's a really good sign. So you'll notice that I'm really talking about form and structure, and I'm not talking about content, because I think the content of whatever the person is offering you, that's a little bit more subjective, and I have some strong opinions about that. But they're not so concrete as, like, can you identify that this is a group that's organized around a charismatic leader who probably is more interested in themselves than in everybody else? But as far as the content goes, if you are motivated by this mentor, let's say, to deepen your sense of what it means to be connected with the rest of your neighborhood and your community, and to be in service with other people, then I think you're probably on the right track. If the concentration of the content is on sort of micromanaging your internal states so that you always feel a particular way, or that you try to generate, I don't know, peak experiences or whatever, then I think that's probably it's going to be a little bit less connective and a little bit less service oriented, and it also falls into the category of, well, how do I actually know that I'm doing it right? How do I actually know that I'm progressing along this spiritual path? And that was really, really clear from the two groups that I was in. So I'm kind of grateful for that there was no illusion with either of these groups that they were doing any kind of social service. Their only social service was to recruit more members, right? And in some organizations, that's really, really, really clear. Like, as I was doing journalism on cults over the last number of years, I talked to somebody from the Shambhala Buddhist organization that's been through a number of crises. And they said that they left, they grew up in this community, and they left when I think the George Floyd protests were going on. They were actually in Minneapolis in the Dharma Center there, and there were people that needed medical supplies and bottled water and stuff to aid in their protest efforts. And the guy went to his to the leader of the organization, to the temple, and said, "Can we open a donation box for these items?" Right? And the guy said, "Oh, no, we don't do anything political here." And he said, I left at that point because I realized it was just so obvious. Now, not everybody's going to have that sense of politics. Not everybody is going to like see that that's a line in the sand. But for this guy, it was this real sort of moment of realizing that there's a disconnect between this sort of internal attitude that the organization is trying to help people develop and whether or not they're actually going to put it into practice. And if it's just about an internal attitude that you're sort of developing, they can always sell you another course for that, right? Because how are you ever going to know that you're doing it well enough?
In your book, Surviving Modern Yoga, you talk about how harm happens in plain sight. And I think a lot of people don't see this because they're not recognizing what that harm really is. I can already hear the arguments from people saying, well, we're not meant to see everything in the world. We're not. And honestly, I kind of fall into this camp at this point, especially being 7 months pregnant. I'm like, I cannot be outraged by the next thing. I cannot join the next bandwagon. We were never exposed to this much. And so it feels safest in a way, but also maybe even most productive for me to actually turn inward, to focus on the people that live within my walls. And if I'm expanding outward in my local community. And so there's this pressure, like everyone online right now, speaking of Minneapolis, is talking about if you're staying silent, this. And it's like, okay, so your Instagram reel really changed the world right now. And because I'm not doing an Instagram reel, I'm lesser of a person. Like, what does this mean? And so where is that line of being sucked into everything political and actually turning inward to change yourself so you can have a ripple with real people that touch you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're setting up a really reasonable sort of division between how are you going to be a human being in the world and how are you going to be a human being in yourself. And I think that if we're really smart about that, then I wouldn't say that it's so much a matter of how can I use X practice or Y prayers or these herbs to become a better person so that it ripples outwards, but more like in the style of like Andrea Davis or Audre Lorde or Rosa Parks. I'm going to practice yoga because that keeps me sane and relatively connected and honest with myself while I do this work of serving other people, So I think that and what you're saying about being pregnant or any other circumstance that you would have that would limit your capacity or your willingness or the rationality of going out and taking an action that might not even be in your personality framework, that has to be respected, right? Like nobody is valued by pressuring anybody else into actions that they don't believe in, right? So I think that I have also seen what you're referring to with regard to a kind of pressure to use a platform to do some educational or support work. And I think that's an important sort of request to make, or it's a valid thing for people who are sort of watching influencer culture as a barometer of what's happening in the culture at large. It's reasonable to discuss that and to perhaps even advocate for it. But I don't think anybody is served by trying to do it if they don't know how, or it doesn't feel like they have the energy or the bandwidth to do it. And I just want to say too that like I think social media appeals like that can kind of conceal, even when the person doesn't mean it, they conceal the true nature of organizing movements, which really do function according to needs and abilities, right? So I'm 54 years old. We have 2 kids at home. Well, one kid's at school, the other kid is autistic and homeschooled. There's a lot of care work. It's very difficult for me to add activist activities to my schedule. But because of that, there's a place for me in the movements that I'm welcome in, right? Because I can do other things. I can write analysis. I can, offer self-care support. I can, you know, um, produce historical content that helps people understand their place in history a little bit better. So I think there's work for everybody, for sure.
Mm. You also talk about spiritual bypassing, which is something that comes up even in the high demand groups. It's like they're talking about it while they're doing it.
Right.
But you talk about it as something that organizations actually teach people to do without you realizing it, rather than something that somebody falls into. How does that work exactly?
Well, I think anytime that there's a self-sealing ideology, a certain type of bypassing is assured. And what I mean by that is that in a high demand group, if everything comes back to, well, the text says so, or the leader's vision, or the intuition of spirit is that, you know, so on and so forth, so that any question that comes up in relation to an actual material problem or a contradiction or, some form of mistreatment perhaps in the community, anytime that it rolls back to an explanation that's already canned, spiritual bypassing will happen, and it will be instructed to happen. It will be encouraged, right? It's like you come to a kind of brick wall of engagement and belief and faith, and the group has got to have strategies there for helping people sort of ignore the fact that they've gotten to a brick wall or to a contradiction. A lot of the time, the training, the implicit training that a group will offer to its members will involve a kind of encouraging distrust or perhaps even repudiating outside sources of knowledge, right? And so, if, for instance, because the Buddhist teacher that I was first with seemed to be extremely fluent in liturgical Tibetan and seemed to be able to recite long passages from medieval scriptures flawlessly. Uh, he was given, and I ended up giving him a lot of credibility. But I didn't know liturgical Tibetan from Adam. And so, like, I didn't have any sort of basis for giving him that authority. And so there was no need for any other outside source to check or to discuss or to debate whether or not the idea this guy was unpacking from, 14th century Tibet was actually valid. And so, um, when you're in a situation in which, for some reason, you've just excluded outside knowledge, then there's no real resort to anything, to any other opinion or point of view when you come up to a crisis of faith than to go back to, the source that is governing the entire organization. Um, and then the other thing that high demand groups will do is that, at crisis points of faith, they will offer like somatic and kinetic rituals of prayer or trance states or, dancing or, group meditation. And I think sometimes those can operate as ways of kind of reinforcing spiritual bypassing as the kind of go-to answer for when the person starts asking questions, right? It's like, oh, and often, the telltale instruction there or comment there is, oh, you're too much in your brain, or you're too much in your thinking mind right now, or you're you're in one of the groups I was in. The insult was, oh, you're just floating around in your own concepts, and I'm like, actually, the concept
That's a good one. I'm going to take it.
Yeah. Actually, the concept was, you're full of shit, and I want an answer to this particular question. And then the response to that would be, you know what? What you really have to do is to let the light of God into your heart, and we're going to do a ritual to help you do that. And so I think that's kind of the training. But I think, that's just an amplification, actually, of the fact that we have to ignore stuff about our lives all the time in order to make them functional, right? So I don't think that the cult environment is doing anything sort of particularly unique. In fact, most of the behaviors that I think we identify as being cultic or high demand are just amplifications of some of the fairly common distorted ways in which we already have to twist ourselves up, right? So people were saying, Mark Carney, our prime minister here in Canada, gave this speech in Davos that everybody was paying attention to, because he basically said, the old world order of international law and rules has obviously passed by, and we have to be pragmatic and understand what's going on, and get realistic. And people interpreted this as a kind of a breaking of a kind of bypassing in the political process, that everybody had sort of known but ignored, that the order that he was talking about was not working, but now we could admit it. But the problem is that his answer to the problem was to talk about Canada reforming itself in distinction from the U.S. as being a nation of strong and virtuous capitalist values, right? Like, not substantially different, just sort of like, we won't be so extreme, but we'll continue with the tax cuts and austerity and pipelines and oil economy and the rest of it. So it's weird, because he offered this kind of comfort to people, which I would describe as being a form of political bypassing, right? It's like, here's a guy who's offering the same kinds of solutions that create the problems that we're in, and everybody's kind of happy about it. How does that happen? So when bypassing happens in a cultic environment, I think it's tapping into and accelerating or expanding on something that's happening in a lot of different areas in our lives.
What do you think are some of the most kind of dangerous culty groups right now that people might be overlooking?
I'm
politics. To me, that's all I see.
I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure what the most dangerous ones are. I one of the reasons that I am a little bit ambivalent about cult analysis these days is that, I mean, there are definitely high demand, very harmful groups out there. People get their, many years of their lives taken away. Sometimes they, disappear into these groups altogether. One of the groups that I was in, there were people who died of treatable cancer because they were convinced by the leader that all they needed to do was a particular kind of prayer. So there are very, very damaging groups that really hurt people's lives. But I think that when you have like a very strong, wave of literature in a particular domain, which is what we've seen with the last 5, maybe 7 years of, cult memoirs, cult podcasts, cult streaming documentaries. I mean, the number of these works are kind of extraordinary. I don't really know why that's happening, except that there's a lot of, money on the streaming platforms, and people have a lot of documentary ideas, and people are old enough and far enough away from the 90s and early 2000s that they can actually tell these stories, right? So And then in the case of Nexium, like the people who made the documentary were actually participants in the group for a while, and they could actually get onto the inside and sort of watch it fall apart as it was happening. They also kind of provoked it a bit, which is another story. But like, we have a lot of literature out there now, and it almost has a true crime feeling to it. And the suspicion that I have is that the cultural work that the cult documentary does, or the cult memoir, or the streaming series, or whatever, is that it kind of distracts people from the high demand or unreasonable organizations or social arrangements that they're engaged with already, right? It's like, I think a lot of people watch cult stuff and they say, oh, God damn, that's really bad. I would never be so stupid. And boy, it's better you than me. And geez, I wonder what's going on psychologically with that person that they got, rung up with that. And meanwhile, you might be working for Amazon. You might be driving a truck and having to urinate in a bag because you're not allowed to take a break. You might be, struggling under minimum wage somewhere, or you might be in a, caregiving profession, but not making enough money, and you have to take a second job at Walmart. Like, it's the purpose of police drama, in my view, and this is not an original view, is to get a lot of people to sort of invest in the notion that policing is entertainment, right? And that, the cops are keeping things in order, and they can be heroes, and they're doing tough work against the bad guys and all of that. And there's something similar about the cult literature, which is that it does this kind of cultural work of convincing normal people, so-called normal people, that they are not actually in shitty conditions. And a lot of the time they actually are.
Yeah. Again, I come back to politics right now. I just see the right versus left just feels like two big cults to me. And it does when I'm concerned about one, and then now the next one takes power and I'm still concerned. But everyone who was concerned about maybe overreaching power in 2020 is now not concerned about overreaching power. They're just defending it over here. And so it's almost like when you join a group that you feel like you belong in, you become so attached to it that your first job, the mind's first job, is to defend it rather than actually even coming back to your values. I think that's what it comes back to is a lack of the values. You can't say this thing over here just because your people are in power and the opposite over here. And I think we are constantly doing that in the groups that we feel like we belong to, the groups that we feel see us in some way.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I can appreciate the sense that there's kind of like a snake eating its tail, or a yin and yang sort of fluidity to political discourse in the States. When you reference getting caught up in the kind of surface level of who's, what people are you with, and that process sort of erasing your sense of core values from you. I think that's where I focus. And I think that, the core values I have are about what is fair and workable and human in human economy and political terms. And so, the notion of personally battling, another group from within the sort of familial or the tribal identity of your group often misses the point, which is that uh, the 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 world economy as we have it for the last 150, well, it's been analyzed for the last 150 years, but for the last 400 years or so, is really divided up into people who have capital and people who don't, and people who are able to use capital to exploit others and people who don't, people who are wage laborers. And I think that basic distinction is something that I just keep at the heart of how I see the world, right? And there can be people on both sides of a duopoly who don't actually see that clearly and feel that somehow politics is more about identity, or it's more about culture, or and that it's not actually about who actually owns the stuff that we need to live, and what are they making us pay to use it.
Another thing you often talk about is kind of this intersection between New Age spirituality and conspiracy theory. They're sort of merging in some spaces. But where is the line for you between healthy questioning of power and sliding into conspiracism? Because to me, even in the beginning, when you said, I couldn't understand why the imbalance of wealth, I couldn't understand why no one was doing anything about this. Frankly, when you look at it through the lens of, the people in power are for themselves, quite like a cult leader would be, and they're selling us something that ultimately serves them. Technically, that's a conspiracy. And we find out that there are conspiracies happening all the time. Like the opioid epidemic, like every year there's a new big one. And so to me, it's always interesting when somebody's like, well, you don't want to be a conspiracy theorist. And I'm like, oh, so you don't want me to know about it before it's happening? You want me to wait until it comes out in 10 years? Where's that line for you?
This is such an important question, because there, in the kind of anti-disinformation and debunking space that some of my journalism takes place in, there's a general attitude that the conspiracy theory is something that the vulnerable or gullible or stupid or ignorant person will sort of indulge in. And they'll indulge in it because they have, I don't know, cognitive defects. They can't see things clearly, right? And I think that's really, really misguided, because many, many, many conspiracy theories either draw on something that is absolutely true, or they mirror patterns, social and political patterns, that actually are true. And I think the Epstein files is an excellent example of the worldwide exposure slowly coming of something that looks very much like what the QAnon organization, online conspiracy theory organization, was describing for years. Now, they had their own, many of the actors within QAnon had their own motives for that. They were incentivized in various ways. A lot of them were like, economic grifters. They wanted to sell supplements. They wanted to get people into their spiritual classes. They wanted to get people into their, come to my breathwork class so that you don't have to get vaccinated thing. Like they were selling a lot of stuff, but there was a basic storyline about the structure of power in the world and its relationship to the abuse of children that is not incorrect. And so what do we do with that? But let me back up a little bit and just say that, the basis of the work that I've done on conspirituality really starts with noticing that there's a conceptual overlap between New Age spirituality and the structure of how a conspiracy theory begins to emerge. And that conceptual overlap is really it's embodied in three statements. And the three statements are: everything is connected, everything has a purpose, and nothing is as it seems. Now, these are things that you would hear in any introductory class on A Course in Miracles, on, light work channelers, whatever, any kind of content around, I don't know, divine channeling, or whatever. You would hear these principles that everything is connected, everything has a purpose, nothing is as it seems. And they're actually really hopeful and transformative principles when people bump into them. It's like, oh, everything is connected, everything has a purpose. Oh my gosh, right? It's not I don't have a meaningless life, and nothing is as it seems. Well, if things are bad now, I don't know whether there's some deeper message that, I need to access, or that's, coming to the fore, or something like that. And so these can be very, very hopeful messages. And then they can also curdle into a kind of paranoia, right? Which is, oh my God, everything is connected. Oh my God, everything is has a purpose, and it's pointed at me, and nothing is as it seems, meaning everybody's lying at me. And so there's a positive interpretation and affect that you can bring to those three beliefs, and then that positive affect can curdle into paranoia at a certain point. And so that's the relationship that we looked at for a long time. But I'd also say that the New Age community within the global North really is built around political disengagement, right? Like, it emerges out of the 1970s and a period of kind of personal development and the workshop circuit culture, and an explosion of health food stores with their cork boards and all of the events that you could go to in your neighborhood that were all about taking care of yourself. Now, this is the decade after there's almost a worldwide socialist revolution in a number of global North countries. Now, why doesn't that happen? Well, it's suppressed. It falls apart. Protesters against the Vietnam War in the late 1960s, they did not stop the Vietnam War, but instead the National Guard came out and shot them at Kent State. And so there was this feeling at a certain point that in the culture that, oh, I guess the world isn't going to change. Maybe we should just work on ourselves, right? And that sort of initiates this era of political disengagement or vagueness. And yeah, that means that when QAnon rolls through the yoga and wellness worlds in around 2019, 2020, people don't really have a resistance to it. They're being radicalized politically, but it's because they don't really have any sort of place to stand politically beforehand, because what they've been mostly interested in is, yoga and smoothies and herbal eating or whatever. And so, yeah, it was a it's a big problem. And I have a story that I always like to tell about the difference between the conspiracy and the conspiracy theory that you actually just sort of pointed to. And that's that, if the listener can imagine that they are, sitting in a bar in Boston in 2001 or something like that, and they hear a guy at the end of the bar getting drunk and starting to yell about how all of the priests in Boston are actually pedophiles, and that Cardinal Law doesn't really care about any of them, and he's just shipping them around. And you're wondering what's wrong with the guy, and everybody in the bar thinks he's crazy. And then you talk to the bartender after he gets kicked out, and the bartender says, yeah, he's doing this every night. And I don't know, something might have happened to him or something like that. I don't know. He's living by himself. His wife left him. Nobody takes him bowling anymore. A year later, the Boston Globe comes out with a spotlight story saying, in fact, here are all the priests in the Boston Archdiocese who, were found to have abused children, and this is what Bernard Law did to cover that up. And then it's a story. Now, what's the difference between the guy in the bar and the journalists who were able to tell that story? It's access, it's resources, it's, objective distance, it's institutional support. But you got to be careful not to call the guy in the bar a crazy person, you have to be careful not to do that, because he might be telling you something that, I mean, the same thing happens with Virginia Giuffre, right? She describes what happened to her long before there were enough resources on board to really solidify that evidence. And so I think we all have to think about the distance between the person who's most deeply traumatized by a conspiracy and what a conspiracy theory sounds like before it's evidenced, because that's a really important period. And we can throw those people out of society because we don't like what they're saying, and then then what happens? My pet theory is that QAnon is given some kind of life or additional juice because there are so many people who found in its community's willingness to speak openly about its, macabre story of the world. And the people who were attracted to it were people whose own stories were never listened to. I can't substantiate that, that's not a scientific finding, but I have the sense that, like, when you do not listen carefully to your fellows, they might say things that, in order to get attention or in order to attract attention, or they might be attracted to stories that seem to mythologically reflect what they themselves have been through.
I'm reminded, even with that whole rabbit hole, I went into it first to join a cult, first to leave. I was suspicious by the idea that, all this information, there's a lot of evidence to it. I think one of the things that I found really interesting was the story of the two Coreys, for example, Corey Feldman and Corey Haim. And Corey Feldman was basically trying to speak for his best friend who died and was saying the biggest problem in Hollywood has always been pedophilia, and it always will be. And everyone thought he was crazy and they ruined his career. And then all of this stuff comes out, Diddy, Epstein. But if it's one thing to bring certain things to light, it's another to say there's one savior and it's this man, and all you have to do is elect him or whatever it is. And right. So that's always when my spidey senses are up. And so that you're right when you say so many of these things are built on either really good principles, things that sound really good. I feel like Nexium had a lot of great things to say until they start burning people, branding people with the founder's name, or Scientology. I get why people get in all those lower rungs, and then you get to you've invested so much and now an alien's coming or something like that. I haven't gone too deep, but it's just realizing that you become, it's like in marketing where you learn to get them to say yes, 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 yes. And so when you get to the big ask, they're more likely to say yes instead of putting up their defenses. Now you've drawn them in with all these yeses. And so the next logical thing is going to be another yes.
Right. Yeah. 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 That makes sense. I agree with that.
So if somebody is realizing that they might be in a high demand group right now, what would you say the first step is?
I would try to call up an old friend. And, this would have to be somebody who knew you well from an earlier time in your life when you definitely were not in the same kind of circumstance. And try to connect with them and try to see how their life has gone, see what kind of questions they ask about your new life. One of the best sort of experiences I ever had in my life, actually, I would say, is that it's the letter's still up on my wall, actually, is that I got a letter from a friend a couple of years after I joined a high demand group. And the letter basically said, this is a really hard letter to write, and I really don't want to be intrusive. And I often am very confused about things, but sometimes I'm very perceptive. And I think one of the things I'm perceptive about is that you've really sort of gone all in on this guy having all of your answers. And I just don't think that's the way the world works. And so I'm wondering if you're okay with that. And I'm wondering if, I really hope that you don't think you're too good to be my friend anymore. And I hope that you reserve that small, quiet space inside that thinking people have in order to defend themselves against fraud. And I think I received that letter, and I just couldn't believe how kind it was, how generous it was. He really took a risk. And I know you asked, like, what should the person do? But if you don't have a friend who's got the skill to do that, then it's a little bit harder. But I think that a friend from your previous life, and it might not be a family member, because one of the reasons that you might be involved in the high demand group is that you're running away from family. But if you find the friend, it's likely that they'll be able to reflect something of the old self back to you, right? They'll be able to reality check what you are doing against what they know of you. And if they're a good friend, if they're a kind friend, they will limit that reality checking to, just questions that you would find helpful. So, and I mean, like, I'm saying all of that after hopefully the person has done the basics of researching the organization thoroughly. I mean, one of the good things about living in the internet age is that you literally cannot join a group without reading basically the Yelp reviews on the group, right? Like people are and there are bad aspects to that as well, with regard to people anonymously complaining and trying to screw up other people's communities. But I think the old principle of where there's smoke, there's fire applies. And I think as soon as you start to get the hint that there's controversy around, a certain person, there's something to look into. I think I would also ask, why did you end up there? Like, what literally drove you there? And don't look for the psychological reason, right? Like, I said for years that the moment that the Buddhist teacher really locked me in was the moment that, I was sitting alone with him in sort of a private meeting after a teaching that he gave. And he said to me, I said to him, what do you think I will be able to get from Buddhist teaching? And he looked me in the eye and he said, you'll realize that you are going to die and you have to do something about it to prevent that from happening. And there was a very sharp, like, personal connection. It felt like he really got some sort of claw into me at that point. And that he wasn't going to let go and I wasn't going to let go. And I, for a long time, thought, oh yeah, that was the start of it. That was the start of it. And it took me many more years to realize, oh, wait a minute. There was a whole sequence of events that got me into that room. And those events were personal, yes, but they were also cultural. They were social. They were economic. Like, the fact that I could pick up just for this is just a very, very simple example. The fact that I could pick up things, my possessions, and with a plane ticket, fly to where his next retreat was, and then do that periodically for the next 3 years, was dependent on me having a credit card. It was dependent upon me having, a kind of non-professional life. It was dependent upon me having, uh, frail social connections that were not sort of keeping me in place. And then you have to start asking, like, okay, well, why did those things all happen? Why did my life turn out like that? And if you do a kind of forensic walk back through the conditions that led you to where you are, you'll understand why this person is compelling to you in a way that is less magical, right? And I think that's really key, because the person who sort of bursts into your life in a burst of flame and, makes you feel like, oh, this person is going to save me, that moment is happening after a long, long, long period of stress and confusion. And it's almost like, you've tightened down into a rock or a stone and they're just going to like strike you like a flint or something like that, and there's going to be a spark, but something made the stone really hard before that.
And so where did you land with your spirituality, or do you dismiss all of it now?
Oh, no. I don't just, there's, I think because I started to do journalism on yoga and wellness, this very common sort of comment started coming up on social media that, this guy hates yoga, or this guy, he hates all religion, or he's just a total atheist or something like that. I mean, look, like, anybody who would say that just is sort of concentrating on the fact that I have a very critical perspective on spiritual organizations, but they probably don't know that, I was born a Catholic, and I don't think that ever will really leave me. I'm not a churchgoer, but I feel very sort of culturally, and I would say spiritually, attached to forms of Christianity that move into social justice, the social gospel. Like I grew up in a very traditional Catholic church, which drove me away because it was traditional and conservative, and it said all kinds of weird things about gender and sexuality, and of course it was riven by institutional abuse, and it played a role in colonizing the country that I live in. All of these things were intolerable to me. At the same time, there are moments of Catholic liturgy that probably still hold more meaning to me in terms of having explanatory power for what I'm feeling than anything else I've come across. Maybe that's because I grew up with them, maybe because I have, sort of poured new stuff into them. Maybe it's because I finally came into contact with liberation theology, which is basically Catholicism plus Marxism later in my life, and that makes a lot of sense. But like, there's no part of me that rejects the need for religious relief and spiritual comfort and guidance. And I'm just skeptical about the delivery systems, right? And I think that where it all really meets where it all meets the road, so to speak, is that as a parent, as I mentioned, our younger son is autistic, and the support needs can be substantial, but there's also like just this incredible learning process for what I understand love to be, what I understand service and selflessness to be. There's been nothing more radicalizing than that particular relationship. And I don't think that I would have understood or felt it that way if I didn't have some sort of feeling that the material circumstances of my life are at the basis of my, spirituality, and the fact that I'm called to learn about, this person and to help them, become whoever they're going to be. And I also have really, I think one of the most important concepts that I've come across in the last 10 years is that's helped me spiritually is the notion from, there's a lot of Marxist literature on this, and Simone Weil says this, that loving somebody means participating in who they will become, regardless of what it is. You don't know what the outcome is. You don't know who they will become, but you are participating in their potential to become something, to become who they are, and you're investing in that. And that's very, 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 very different than all of the forms of love and attachment that I was taught, or that I grew up with, in which love was really about protection or idealization, or hoping that something turned out the way that you wanted it to. So yeah, those are some thoughts about my spiritual life.
Well, thank you so much for just coming on this show.
Yeah.
And I mentioned earlier, I've come back to your podcast multiple times because of my own spidey senses. One example is I interviewed somebody in person, and I thought I liked them. And then I was like, I don't know about this. And about a year later, you ended up having multiple episodes on this person. And so what I'm always trying to do is, I'm a very spiritual person, and I probably lean even more so than you land. But I love the woo. I see everything is connected.
Yeah.
And I see the dangers of being in that place, how people can take advantage of it. And I think one of the hardest things about building a brand online is watching people end up in places that I don't ever want to be associated with. And so I always try to bring in conversations that help people discern for themselves. They don't need to land on my beliefs. They don't need to fall into any sort of tribe here. It's all about discernment and really finding a path that is genuinely beneficial to you. So for listeners that are interested in learning more about your work, where's the best place they can connect?
Well, so I'm co-host of Conspirituality podcast. I have another podcast project that's called Anti-Fascist Dad at the moment. That's now into its 16th episode, I guess. I am on Substack. I have a book coming out called Anti-Fascist Dad. It's coming out in April. The book that I wrote with Derek Barris and Julian Walker on Conspirituality was out a couple of years ago. I am on TikTok at Anti-Fascist Dad, and also YouTube under that handle as well. So happy to hear from anybody.
Want to work through this week's Mind Love Challenge with others? The Mind Love Collective is a free community with monthly themed calls, weekly challenge accountability, and real support throughout the year. So join us at mindlove.com/join. Thanks for giving your mind a little love today, and I'll see you next week.